Dead Men's Secrets, or Dead Men Tell Tales. You've probably watched PBS a time or two and seen a special or some kind of a TV documentary, that details, in some regard, some ancient relics, some ancient buildings, like the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And then they'll give you the numbers that go along with it, like this is the most massive building ever built in the history of the world to this day, as I speak to you today, as you're listening. The Great Pyramid of Cheops is the most massive building. Until about 1935, it was also the tallest building ever built in the world, until the Empire State Building was built back in 1935. The Great Pyramid was the biggest, tallest building in the world. And they'll tell you, some statistics and one thing and another, and then we sit here in awe, and we kind of marvel, because you see, when we go to public school, they tell us that man, years and years ago, was a brute beast evolving from apes, and that we were really pretty dumb, dragging our knuckles on the ground and hitting our women over the head and dragging them off into the cave, And so, if your view of the world, or your world view, is based upon evolution, and then you look at this great pyramid out here, this great building, and you listen to these numbers over here, they don't add up. They don't add up. Now, I'm a general contractor, and I build buildings. And when we build a house, if that house is plus or minus an inch, that's plenty good enough. And when we get them a little out of square, they're 2-3 inches out of square, no big deal. We just cover it up, by dividing the inch or the 3 inches, in half. And then when we put the roofing on, we fudge a little bit over here at the bottom, and then we fudge a little bit up there at the opposite top. And when you look at it, you can't see it. It's not that big a deal. And that's building a house. Now, the Great Pyramid, to show you how accurate it is, in 1964, they developed, I don't know who it was, but somebody developed what they call a laser transit. Now, we've had transits, for hundreds of years. An eyepiece, a telescope, in which we could put a man out there in the field, 100, 200, 300, 400 feet out there. We can measure elevations with a stick, and we can measure straight lines and things like that. It's been going on for a long time. So we've been surveying and measuring, for centuries. But the accuracy of it wasn't all that great. And so we've been making maps, for hundreds of years. But the maps, aren't exactly accurate. And so as time progresses along, we've been getting more accurate maps. And so about 1964, somebody comes up with a new type of transit, and it's called the laser transit, and it's much more accurate, than the old transits. And so as time progresses along, technology improves, and we get more accurate readings. And so somebody went over to the Great Pyramid and they measured it up, and let's see, well, how square is it? Now, the thing sits on 14 acres. It's not like building a house. I mean, an acre is 43,560 square feet. So if you can remember, that's about 40,000 square feet. If you've got a house that sits on 10,000 square foot lot, that's a quarter of an acre. You're on round numbers. 11,000 square feet would be a little closer. So if your lot's 11,000 square feet, now, that's a quarter of an acre, and then on that house you build a house, and if you can build that house within an inch or two of square, that's pretty good. And this is modern times. Well, the Great Pyramid sits on 14 acres. Let's just take 14 times 4. 14 times 4. That's 56 times bigger than your lot. 56 times bigger. And if your lot, is an eighth of an acre over here, well, then it's about 112 times bigger. And the thing measures corner to corner on all four corners within 1/2 inch of absolute square. 1/2 inch on 14 acres. Now, like I said, I'm an old-timey general contractor, and I look at that and I say, my God, I couldn't build a house that close. I couldn't build a house on your lot to plus or minus 1/2 inch. Now, it could be done. I mean, if we wanted to spend the time, effort, energy, and the money, we could build a house plumb. I don't know that you could build it out of wood and make it plumb, but I think we probably, if we put our minds to it, we could probably do that out of some other material. Now, the reason I say that that's really a spectacular concept is because when I went to school, they told us that in ancient times, these people, they didn't have pulleys. They didn't have Caterpillar tractors. They didn't have the wheel. They didn't have transits. there was a company back in 1964 also that said that if they were going to build the Great Pyramid, that they could build the Great Pyramid, duplicate it the way it is, and they could mine the block from 2,500 miles away, ship it by rail and barge and boat, build the thing, and put the capstone on it. Now that pyramid's sitting up there now without any capstone. Well, this company said that they could put it on there, and then they could do it for $32 billion. And that's a $32 billion. Now that's in 1964 dollars. If you were going to multiply that out, you'd have to double it from 1980 to the present time, so that'd be 64 billion. And then you'd have to probably double that again from 1960 to 1980. I don't know what the inflation rate was in that 20 years, but I guess it was double again. So that'd be 64, and then we got to double again to 128. So talking about it in today's dollars, it'd be about $128 billion. That's a bunch of money. Now, people don't normally go out and just spend $128 billion bucks, just to be spending money or just to be building something. I mean, when you build a building, like the trade towers or the Empire State Building or something like that, there's got to be a return. There's got to be a reason. There's got to be a purpose behind it. And that's a big building. By the way, the building is built with expansion joints. For those of you that might not know what that is, when the sun shines on the Golden Gate Bridge, it's built out of steel, and it expands. And you've got to have expansion joints. So when you're driving on the deck of the bridge, you'll cross over a grate. And that grate is interlocking like the fingers on your hands. And as the sun shines on the steel, it expands and contracts an inch or 2 or 3 or 5. I don't know how much it expands, but it's got an expansion joint in there. Well, the Great Pyramid, when the sun shines on one side of it, it will expand faster, expand more than on the side where the sun isn't shining. So you've got to have a modality for the entire building to expand, or at least that outer shell to expand and contract. And they've got grooves. The builders of the Great Pyramids understood expansion and contraction. And so they built it into the Great Pyramid. Nothing's been there for several thousand years, and it hasn't cracked and broken and fallen down. That's amazing. The Empire State Building hasn't been there for several thousand years, neither has the Golden Gate Bridge or the Bay Bridge. And, of course, the Twin Towers, they didn't last very long. Now, it would say to me that the people who built the Great Pyramid must have had at least the same technology that we had in 1964 to measure it. Just my common sense says to me, if we couldn't measure the damn thing until 1964 because we didn't have a laser transit, then the people that built it had to have at least had the technology of a laser transit to build it. Because up until 1964, boys and girls, we couldn't duplicate it without the laser transit. So whether the guys who built the thing, and I was told this one time, I said, well, how did they level it up? Now the thing sits plumb. It's level. And now they got satellites out there in space with lasers, and they can shoot and they can measure things now pretty darn accurately, and they kind of marvel. I do. I'm an old-timey general contractor, and I got to tell you, I don't think I could build an outhouse that close. I've got 2 outhouses out here, and they're not plus or minus a half an inch. First of all, nobody would spend the time trying to make it that close. It isn't necessary. But then when this thing sits on 14 acres and it's plus or minus plumb, and then it's plus or minus a half inch on 4 corners, sitting on 14 acres, which is bigger than the Empire State Building, which is bigger than the Twin Towers, which is more accurate than either. You got to sit there and say, hey, wait a minute. These guys were not savages dragging their knuckles on the back of the ground. These were not Cro-Magnons. We can't duplicate the thing today. Now, that tells me they got to be smarter than we are. Now, if we could duplicate the thing today, we'd have 4 or 5 of them sitting out there. And you don't see anybody building those today. Now, there had to be a reason for it. I don't know what the reason was. And that's another thing. People don't spend $32, $64, or $128 billion, building the most massive building that's ever been constructed in the history of mankind without a purpose. We haven't got a clue. Can't figure it out. Nobody's spending $128 billion today to build something over there in Washington, D.C. to commemorate World War II. We don't have the money, number one. Number two, if we had the money, we couldn't duplicate it. Don't know how. We don't know how they did it. Well, the guy that wrote the book, Dead Men's Secrets, his name is Jonathan Gray. He he hits upon this very subject matter over here. In fact, it isn't just the Great Pyramid. He hits upon a number of areas of life, like geography, astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, metallurgy, large-scale construction, construction techniques, social organization, engineering, mechanical devices, everyday items, clothing, art, medicine, flight, space travel, ancient science, and civilization. Can you imagine space travel before Christ? Ancient science before Christ, civilization before Christ, flight, medicine, art, and clothing before Christ, equal to or superior to anything that we have today. Now, right away, somebody says, well, if that were true, we would have heard about it from archaeology. You would? You would? Excuse me. In 1940, there was a skeleton up here in the museum in Chicago. I think they call it the Museum of Natural History. It was a 14-foot skeleton. Now, the Bible says there were giants on earth in those days. This is back in Genesis chapter 5, I believe it is, verse 6.